G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Minor Prophets. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Okay, so welcome to tonight. We're looking at Hosea chapter 7, verse 1 to chapter 9, verse 17. Just a very quick recap of what happened last session. We see that there are the northern kingdom, Israel. They're being judged, and the reasons for their judgment against them is the sin of idolatry. And we see it's on both sides of the Jordan, east and west bank of the Jordan. We also see, because of their sin of rebellion, the judgment is coming upon them. Hosea is prophesying to the northern kingdom. Yeah. Hosea spoke about a coming affliction back in chapter 5, but he brings into it, he talks about affliction on Israel and Judah, which is strange because his prophecy is predominantly for Israel. So he prophesies about a future judgment, and this prophecy concerned the coming Assyrian destruction of the northern kingdom, but because he's mentioned Judah, it has to mean something else. And we read of Israel in Hosea seeking help from a king called King Jareb. Now, we know from history that there was no such king, but we know that the name Jareb means destruction or contention. So really, Israel would find no help from this one. So this is not a historic destruction because no such king ruled in the past. So what actually is it? This is the same type of destruction described in both Joel and Amos, and it's the destruction of the day of the Lord. So Hosea is speaking about the day of the Lord as well, because he says here both houses, Israel and Judah, will suffer in the great tribulation. And that's what the name affliction basically means, the tribulation. So one reason they'll suffer in this, suffer such a great destruction is they're going to turn to this King Jareb in Assyria for help. Now, prophetically speaking, this will be the same as turning to the Antichrist and making their covenant with him. Antichrist capital, we know from other books, will be in the region of Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq, which covers the area of Assyria and Babylonia. We also saw that Israel is torn by the lion, but Jehovah God is the lion. And the lion, we see, he destroys loudly by tearing away, which symbolizes external attacks. And this is on both the houses of Israel and Judah. And there's going to be nobody to deliver them because this is in the period of the tribulation. And it's at this critical point in time that they'll finally realize who they must turn to. Now, God said in Hosea 5:15, he says, I will go and return to my place. Now, God's place is in heaven. So now before God can go back to heaven, he must first leave it. Well, we know that God left heaven at the incarnation when he became man in the person of Messiah. So what we also saw was that in Hosea here, they have to acknowledge their offense. It's one offense. One specific offense caused his return to heaven. And the national offense was the rejection of the Messiah on the basis of being demon-possessed. So that specific offense caused him to return to heaven at his ascension on the Mount of Olives. Now, from then on, Israel have been subjected to judgment, but the final judgment will come with the tearing of the lion. And so what they have to do is, we see here in Hosea, is they have to plead for his return, and in their affliction, they're going to seek God earnestly. Affliction, as I said before, is the Old Testament name for the Great Tribulation, one of the Old Testament names for the Great Tribulation, specifically the campaign of Armageddon. Now, the precondition of Messiah returning is the confessing of their one offense. So they have to recognize that the root cause of the whole affliction has been the rejection of the Messiah. And there will be a call by the leaders to repent and confess the confession of Israel's national sin, which we find in Isaiah 53. And then they have to plead for his coming. And this is when their lack of knowledge, which Hosea speaks about, they perish because of lack of knowledge. So we see that was a little parentheses where Isaiah spoke about this future affliction. Now, we see in the section that we're in, which is the rightness of Israel for the judgment of destruction, we see the cause of judgment is the broken covenant. Israel broke the Mosaic covenant. And we see in the time that Hosea is prophesying about here, you know, the Levites, the spiritual leaders, actually turned into gangs, and they were wandering on the highways, killing and robbing people. And that's how low Israel have sunk. Israel are guilty of spiritual prostitution and defilement, and also there's a harvest of punishment which is now coming for them as well before the Assyrian captivity hits them. So this is where we're up to today. So we're going to see Israel's fatal domestic policy. And we see this in chapter 7, verses 1 to 9, Hosea. Now, chapter 7, verse 1, when I would heal Israel, then is the iniquity of Ephraim uncovered, and the wickedness of Samaria. For they commit falsehood, and the thief entereth in, and the troop of robbers ravageth without. And they consider not in their hearts that I remember all their wickedness. Now have their own doings beset them about. They are before my face. So in verses 1 to 7, he deals with this domestic policy, which for Israel has become disastrous. He begins in verse 1 by picturing Israel as being incurably sick. And every time God tries to move towards Israel, at that very moment, as his healing hand stretches out, what is uncovered is falsehood from within and bands of robbers from without. Israel is just so sinfully sick, inward and outward, that God's healing hand is withdrawn. And in verse 2, he says that God is cognizant of the wickedness. God takes note of every sin. And as always, sin has within itself the seeds of its own destruction, and their sins will destroy them. They have become so bad that there is just no way back for them. In verse 3, they make the king glad with their wickedness, and the princes with their lies. They are all adulterers. They are as an oven heated by the baker. He ceases to stir the fire from the kneading of the dough until it be leavened. In the day of our king, the princes made themselves sick with the heat of wine. He stretched out his hand with scoffers. It seems here like they're bent on destroying themselves, that he now describes the conspiracies within in these couple of verses here, verses 3 to 7. There was one conspiracy after another against whichever king was in power. And in verse 3, he pictures the conspirators as easing their guard of the king and the prince through wickedness and lies, you know, buddying up to the king. We're really your friends. And in verse 4, he pictures this conspiracy like a kindled oven. So the oven is kindled at night, the wood is put in there, it's just kindled away and is left alone. And meanwhile, you know, with the baker, the dough is allowed to leaven and rise. And so just like the dough, the conspiracy is allowed to develop in the course of time. Now in verse 5, in the day of our king, he and the princes are made drunk. The day of the king could be either his birthday or his anniversary of his coronation or something like that. We're not sure. But they're celebrating and they become sick with the heat of wine. And even the king himself reaches out for more strong drink. This is the king of Israel, the northern kingdom. For they have made ready their heart like an oven. While they lie in wait, their baker sleepeth all the night. In the morning it burneth as a flaming fire. They are all hot as an oven, and devour their judges. All their kings are fallen. There is none among them that calleth unto me, so unto God. Now we see in verse 6, the conspiracy is now in full bloom. Just as in the morning, the baker comes along, he gets out of bed and the dough is now leavened, it's risen a bit. He now stirs up the fire, stirs up the coals to make it roaring hot, and he's now ready to put the bread in to bake it. And it is at this point, where the baker is at this point like this now, that the conspiracy has come to full fruition. It's been steaming along, and now it's been stirred up and it's full blown. And in verse 7, it now leads to the assassination of kings. And he says the kings have fallen. And now the last of Israel's 6 kings, the last 4 of Israel's 6 kings were assassinated. All of them were assassinated. Zechariah was assassinated in 2 Kings 15:10. Shallum in 2 Kings 15:14. Pekahiah in 2 Kings 15:25, Pekah in 2 Kings 15:30. And the section ends, none among them call unto me. So nobody in Israel is inquiring of God whom they wanted to have, or whom he wanted to have as king in Israel. Just for your own info, in the northern kingdom, kingship was to be based upon either divine appointment or prophetic sanction. So it had to be, you couldn't just choose who you want to be king. It had to be either by divine appointment or prophetic sanction. Now, in the south, in Judah, it was based upon being a member of the house of David. You had to be in the lineage of King David. But in the north, they sought their kings of their own making. And if they didn't like him, they would just conspire for assassination. And while the southern kingdom was always ruled by one dynasty, the dynasty of David, the northern kingdom had 9 dynastic changes. And also the southern kingdom, along with being of the line of David, again, you had to have prophetic sanction as well. So not only does Israel have a fatal domestic policy, in verses 8 to 16, they also have a disastrous foreign policy. So within the land, it's a shocker. Now, what do they do outside in their foreign policy? We see this in verses 8 to 16 of chapter 7. Verse 8, Ephraim, he mixes himself among the rebels, among the peoples, sorry. Ephraim is a cake not turned. Strangers have devoured his strength, and he knoweth it not. Yes, grey hairs are here and there upon him, and he knoweth it not. And the pride of Israel does testify to his face. Yet they have not returned unto Jehovah their God, nor sought him for all this. So he describes Israel's disastrous foreign policy here in verses 8 to 10, and he pictures Ephraim or Israel as a cake not turned. And in verse 8, Israel is mixing herself among the nations by adopting their heathen ways, their pagan ways. And this is in violation of Mosaic command of Exodus 34, 12 to 16. They were to be separated from the pagan ways, and now they fail to separate themselves from such sins. In fact, they're joining in with it. And so they become like a cake that is not turned. Now, a cake not turned, though it was cooked in those days, the way it was cooked, it was on hot coals. It meant if it wasn't turned, it meant that it would be burned on the bottom, but it would remain uncooked or doughy on the top, and it wouldn't be very nice to eat. Nobody'd want to eat it. So that's what Ephraim has become. It's become like a cake not turned. Burnt on the bottom, no good on the top. Nobody wants to have a bar of it. Now in verse 9, the strength of Israel has ebbed, and he doesn't even know it. All the grey hairs, they're getting old, they're getting weak. In verses 7 to 10, God testifies to Israel's face and still has no response. And again, we see here that he is the pride and the excellency of Israel. And he testifies against them, and they still don't repent. There is no returning and no seeking of the God of Israel. None whatsoever. And then in verse 11, Ephraim is like a silly dove. without understanding. They call unto Egypt, they go to Assyria. When they shall go, I will spread my net upon them. I'll bring them down as the birds of the heavens. I will chastise them as their congregation has heard. So not only is Israel like a cake not turned, in verses 11 to 12, she's like a silly dove. She flutters between two kingdoms, easily seduced. In verse 12, this dove, because of going back and forth, trying to work one kingdom against the other, Egypt against Assyria, she even tried to align herself with Egypt against Assyria. Now she'll be caught up in a net. She'll be brought down, she'll be hemmed in, and now she's going to be trapped for punishment. And then he describes Israel with a third figure. And now Israel in verses 13 to 16 is now like a deceitful bow. Woe unto them, for they have wandered from me. Destruction unto them, for they have trespassed against me. Though I would redeem them, yet they have spoken lies against me. In verse 13, Israel is guilty of speaking lies against God. You'll notice it begins with the word woe. Prophets use the word woe heavily against the judgments of God, and often describing them as woe judgments. Though Hosea, he only uses it twice. He used it once here, and then we're going to see it in one more time in chapter 9, verse 12. Now, other prophets use it more frequently, like Isaiah, for instance, but it is woe to them for speaking lies against their God. And because they've so sinned and trespassed, destruction will now come upon them. Now, back as we see back in, or as we saw back in chapter 7, verse 1, every time God wished to heal them, he was frustrated by their sin. It happens again here. Every time God decided to redeem them, he was frustrated by their sins and lies. Now, it's not because of God's unwillingness. It is their spiritual or their sinful problem. They remain unhealed of the spiritual sickness and unredeemed of their enslavement to sin. And their lying against God in verse 13 now led to rebellion against God in verse 14. And they have not cried unto me with their heart, but they howl upon their beds. They assemble themselves for grain and new wine. They rebel against me. So they don't return to God. And when they do assemble together, they don't assemble to worship God. They merely assemble for more food and drink. It's part of their worship of these idols. And in verse 15, though I have taught and strengthened their arms, yet do they devise mischief against me. It's against God. So Hosea spells out Israel's treachery against God. It was God who taught them. It was God who strengthened them. What's their response? They take what they learned and they use it to devise mischief against God. In verse 16, they return, but not to him that is on high. They are like a deceitful bow. Their princes shall fall by the sword for the rage of their tongue. This shall be their derision in the land of Egypt. So it is at this point we see the figure of the bow coming in. It's emphasizing, if it's a deceitful bow, it's emphasizing Israel's bad aim. When they do aim their arrow, their aim is not to return to God, but to go to Egypt. And for that reason, they will fall. Now, Israel was seeking help of Egypt against the Assyrians. They thought with Egypt's help, they could win over Assyria. They could defeat Assyria. Now, Egypt tried to help them, but the Egyptian army failed to help. And so the Egyptian help will prove to be a derision when Egypt does fail them. So this is Israel's bad aim. It's a deceitful bow. Now, if you recall the meaning of the word sin, it means the key word for sin means to miss the mark. You know, you're firing something and you miss the mark. But to miss the mark also means you hit the wrong mark. And that's the picture here. Israel missed her mark and she hit the wrong one. She was always seeking the help of human armies against her enemies and never turning to God. Now we see the call of the trumpet of judgment in verses 1 to 14 of chapter 8. This is a new theme, but it's along the same lines. And this call of the trumpet judgment is against 5 specific things. First of all, it's against the covenant breakers of chapter 8, verses 1 to 3. Set the trumpet to thy mouth. As an eagle he cometh against the house of Jehovah, because they have transgressed my covenant and trespassed against my law. They shall cry unto me, my God, we Israel know thee. Israel hath cast off that which is good, the enemy shall pursue him. So the first thing that he calls the trumpet of judgment against is against these covenant breakers. The call we see in verse 1, and he pictures the judgment coming as an eagle, emphasizing its swiftness, and will come against the house of Jehovah. The house of Jehovah is often used of the temple, but because here it's especially aimed against the northern kingdom, Israel, it's probably a reference to the house of Israel rather than the temple house. Remember, the temple house is in the southern kingdom, Judah. Now, why is this judgment coming? In verse 1, it says that they have broken the covenant. They have broken the law. They've broken the Mosaic covenant or the Mosaic law. And as a judgment comes in verse 2, Israel makes a false cry. In verse 2, she says, as she sees judgment coming, my God, we Israel know thee. Now that's a lie. That's exactly what Hosea says they didn't have. They did not have the knowledge of God because they rejected the knowledge that was available to them. They rejected the prophets. They rejected the righteous priests. They rejected everything that God was trying to tell them. And now when they reach the point of no return, there's no way of averting this judgment. Now they begin crying to God and begin saying, but we know thee, God. You know, you're our God. But that's false. It's a lie. And the proof that it is a lie is given in verse 3, because it says Israel has cast off that which is good. And if they've thrown away that which is good, how can they possibly claim, my God, we know thee? They didn't have a knowledge of God. And so in punishment, they will now be pursued and pursued by the enemy. Now, the second judgment we see of the trumpet judgment is this is the first part of verse 4. It's because of their illegitimate kings. They have set up kings, but not by me. They have made princes, and I knew it not. This is God saying this here. So again, the principle of rulership in the northern kingdom was to be determined by divine appointment or prophetic sanction. In the south was Davidic descent of the Davidic dynasty. And yet, in the northern kingdom, they chose to go with their own way and set up their own kings. And so the second call of trumpets for judgment is against these illegitimate kings. And as a result, one by one king after another will be assassinated. Now, the third reason for the trumpet of judgment is against idolatry. And this is in the second part of verse 4 through to verse 7. Of their silver and their gold have they made them idols, that they may be cut off. So in his third trumpet call, it is specifically against idolatry, which is the main sin that he has been prophesying against since his prophecy began. And he labels this sin as idolatry in verse 4 and then spells out the judgment in verses 5 to 7. He hath cast off thy calf, O Samaria. Mine anger is kindled against them. How long will it be ere they attain to innocency? For from Israel is even this, the workman made it, and it is no God. Yea, the calf of Samaria shall be broken in pieces. For they sow the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. He hath no standing grain, the blade shall yield no meal. If so be it yield, strangers shall swallow it up. Now, this judgment is going to include two things here. First of all, Samaria's golden calf will be destroyed in verses 5 to 6. And golden calf worship will finally cease from the northern kingdom as a result of this judgment. And in verse 7, it says, all their undertakings will be worthless. You're going to sow to the wind, you're going to reap the whirlwind. Now, the land will no longer produce. Israel's crop would be worthless, containing only stalks without grain. And even if she would produce grain, foreigners would come and take it away, and the nation would not benefit from their labor. So the crops are going to fail. All their work will be useless, worthless. The fourth reason for this trumpet of judgment we find in verses 8 to 10, because of her trying to align herself with other countries against Assyria. Verse 8, Israel is swallowed up. Now are they among the nations as a vessel wherein none delighteth. For they are gone up to Assyria like a wild ass alone by himself. Ephraim hath hired lovers. Yea, though they hire among the nations, now will I gather them, and they begin to be diminished by reason of the burden of the king of princes. So this fourth trumpet against her alliance is against Assyria. But Assyria is the nation that God has chosen to bring Israel to its destruction. So as a result, in verse 8, God threatens Israel, and Israel is destined to be swallowed up by the other nations, the very ones she's trying to align herself with. The reason being in verse 9, she tried to hire herself help against Assyria. Notice that that Israel has to pay her lovers. She has hired lovers. Usually it's the other way around. The lovers pay for whatever they want. And when this judgment has run its course in verse 10, the Jewish population in the northern kingdom will be greatly reduced. As we saw from, I think it was Amos, it will be reduced down to 10% of its original population. The fifth and final reason why the trumpet is called is against the altars of sin in verses 11 to 14. Because Ephraim has multiplied altars for sinning, altars have been unto him for sinning. I wrote for him the 10,000 things of my law, but they are counted as a strange thing. So in verse 11, he points out that these altars of sin have been greatly multiplied in the northern kingdom. And with the multiplication of these idolatrous altars in verse 11, in verse 12, the law of Moses has been discarded. In fact, they look at the law of Moses as being something strange, something they're not familiar with. And once again, the implication is that they have lost the knowledge that was available to them. In verse 13, as for the sacrifices of mine offerings, they sacrifice flesh and eat it, but Jehovah accepteth them not. Now will he remember their iniquity and visit their sins. They shall return to Egypt. So for that reason, in verse 13, their many sacrifices are unacceptable because of what he said earlier. Now, while these were the kinds of sacrifices the law of Moses clearly demanded, they were being used for the worship of idols, and these divinely appointed sacrifices were being sacrificed on these altars of sin of verse 11. So as a result, in verse 13, they are now destined for the judgment of captivity, and that will include captivity in Egypt. For while primarily the nation will go into Assyrian captivity, there is going to be a remnant that will end up in captivity down in Egypt. In verse 14, for Israel has forgotten his maker and builded palaces, and Judah has multiplied fortified cities. But I will send a fire upon his cities, and it shall devour the castles thereof. So in verse 14, not only did Israel discard the Mosaic law, But discarding the law also meant that she forgot her maker. And instead of worshipping in the one temple of her maker, she built many temples and many fortresses. But now he points out this fact is not only true for Israel up in the north, but Judah also has multiplied 4 or 5 cities. While Israel is guilty of multiplying altars of foreign gods and idols, Judah also forgot her maker, but she showed it in a different way by fortifying many cities and building many fortifications, showing a lack of trust in her own maker. And now he tells Judah that her many fortresses are going to be destroyed. And in the Assyrian invasion that destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel and took Israel into Assyrian captivity, the Assyrian army also went down into Judah. And while they didn't put an end to the kingdom of Judah, they did destroy 46 fortified cities of Judah. And you see that in 2 Kings 18, verse 13, and that was under Sennacherib. Only Jerusalem actually survived the Assyrian invasion. It was not taken as you would see in 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 20 and onwards. 2 Kings 19:20. Now we see the coming exile in chapter 9, verses 1 to 9. He deals with the theme of the coming exile, and in verses 1 to 2, he announces the death of joy. Rejoice not, O Israel, for joy, like the peoples, for thou hast played the harlot, departing from thy God. Thou hast loved hire upon every grain floor. The threshing floor and the winepress shall not feed them, and the new wine shall fail her. Now, although Israel feels she could now rejoice, the prophet warns the time is coming when there will be the death of such rejoicing. Again, the key reason is in verse 1, is that Israel is guilty of spiritual adultery. She, like Hosea's wife Gomer, has played the harlot. And just like an adulterous wife is stripped, so will Israel be stripped in verse 2, and the land will now fail to reproduce or fail to produce. And again, he points out in verses 3 to 6 that the coming exile is going to be both into Egypt and Assyria. Verse 3, they shall not dwell in Jehovah's land, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt, and they shall eat unclean food in Assyria. So what he hinted at back in chapter 8, he makes clear that they are destined for exile in 2 countries, Assyria and Egypt. Because of such sin, the sin of spiritual adultery and spiritual prostitution, in verse 3, they will no longer get to live in the land. And notice verse 3, it specifies that it is Jehovah's land. It is God's land. It still is Jehovah's land today. It's still God's land today. It is God's land that he has given to his people Israel. That was the home that the husband provided for the wife. But now that she has proven to be an adulteress, she will be stripped and sent out from that home because it is Jehovah's land. They will see themselves returning to Egypt, eating unclean food, and the same thing will be true when they go up to Assyria. In verse 4, they shall not pour out wine offerings to Jehovah, neither shall they be pleasing unto him. Their sacrifices shall be unto them as the bread of mourners. All that eat thereof shall be polluted, for their bread shall be for their appetite. It shall not come into the house of Jehovah. What will you do in the day of solemn assembly and in the day of the feast of Jehovah? For lo, they are gone away from destruction. Yet Egypt shall gather them up. Memphis shall bury them. Their pleasant things of silver, nettles shall possess them. Thorns shall be in their tents. So in verses 4 to 5, there's going to be a cessation of these festivities which the law of Moses demanded, what were used for the worship of idols. So there'll be no more wine offerings, no more sacrifices, no more solemn assemblies, no more feasts like Passover, Pentecost, or Tabernacles, no feasts of Jehovah. Now he did command these things, but they were to be done in his honor, not in the honor of these idols. So as far as God is concerned, just because they took things which the law demanded, it didn't mean by itself that they were following the law. Once they used it for other gods, they discarded the law. So when they go into exile, even these kinds of festivities will come to an end. They will cease. And in verse 6, they will find their burial not in their own land, but in the land of Egypt. And in verses 7 to 9, her activities have also led to the loss of all spiritual discernment. Verse 7, chapter 9. The days of visitation are come. The days of recompense are come. Israel shall know it. The prophet is a fool. The man that hath the spirit is mad. For the abundance of thine iniquity, and because the enmity is great. So they have lost spiritual discernment. And in verse 7, because of it, the day of visitation and recompense will come. It's a day of judgment. And when that day of judgment comes, Israel will know that they are under divine discipline. There won't be any doubt about it. And all their false prophets that prophesied things good are now going to be shown and proven to be fools. And their own wickedness will be shown to be very great. And their false goodness will also be shown to be very great. In verse 8, Ephraim was a watchman with my God. Now, a watchman warns a city of an approaching enemy. God's prophets were to warn the people of coming judgment on sin. In verse 8, he reminds Israel that Israel led. Israel was the leader in the enmity against the true prophets and against the house of God. And we saw one example of this back in the book of Amos, when Amos came into Israel to prophesy, and he was told to be quiet and go back to Judah. We're not interested in hearing what you have to say up here. Go back home. In verse 9, he points out just how deeply into sin they have fallen. He says they have fallen as in the days of Gibeah. Now, what he has in mind here is in the book of Judges, chapter 19. Judges 19 has the story of the Levite and the concubine. And briefly, a Levite had a concubine who left him to return to Bethlehem. He went to fetch her, and they were heading back towards his home in the hill country of Ephraim. And on the way there, they went by the city of Jerusalem. And the Levite servant suggested they turn aside and spend the night in Jerusalem. But at that time, Jerusalem was a Jebusite city. And the Levites said, let's not stay in a Gentile city. Let's go on to Gibeah, so to be among the Jewish people for the night. And when they got to Gibeah, Gibeah had been given over to homosexuality, and they wanted to rape the Levite. And he was protected by his host, but they pushed out the concubine, and she was raped and was killed. And the sin of Gibeah was considered so hideous in the book of Judges that all the other tribes of Israel gathered together to make war against Gibeah. And so there was a general uprising among the other tribes against the Benjamite town of Gibeah. And that's how serious they figured the sin of Gibeah was, and it virtually destroyed the tribe of Benjamin as a result. Now, he says at the time Hosea writes chapter 9, the whole nation had become as bad as Gibeah was back in Judges 19. Nobody sees these as hideous sins anymore. So how much more must punishment come? They look back over the last 30 years and we see things happening today which we'd never have dreamed of. So what we see here is that Gibeah was punished for that sin. How much more then must the punishment come against the whole nation? Now we look at chapter 9, verses 10 to 17, where we see Israel's infidelity. In chapter 9, verse 10, I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your fathers as the first ripe in the fig tree at its first season. But they came to Baal Peor, and consecrated themselves unto the shameful thing, and became abominable like that which they loved. So he deals with a couple of things here. First, in verses 10 to 14, with the apostasy at Baal Peor. In verse 10, he begins by describing Israel's fruitfulness at Sinai. Israel was fruitful, and at Sinai, Israel promised to obey. God found extreme delight in the nation. It was like finding grapes in the wilderness, so refreshing. First ripe fig, beautiful. But later, they migrated from Mount Sinai to Baal Peor, and we can read that story in Numbers 25, verses 1 to 9. And they soon gave themselves over to idolatry and to the worship of foreign gods. So this tendency to idolatry wasn't something new. It was already true in the wilderness. And though they did make a commitment after the worship of the golden calf not to fall into it again, when they arrived at Baal Peor, which is the last stop before entering the promised land, they fell into it again, and they have continued in it. Verse 11, as for Ephraim, their glory shall fly away like a bird. There shall be no birth, and none with child, and no conception. Though they bring up their children, yet will I bereave them, so that not a man shall be left. Yea, woe also to them when I depart from them. Ephraim, like as I have seen Tyre, is planted in a pleasant place. But Ephraim shall bring out his children to the slayer. Give them, O Jehovah, what wilt thou give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts. So in verses 11 to 14, because of their continuance, the punishment is double fruitfulness. Sorry, the punishment now is double fruitfulness, which is what Ephraim means, double fruitfulness, now is to become fruitlessness, fruitless. Here he plays a game with the meaning of Ephraim. Ephraim means double fruit, double fruitfulness, but now he says double fruitfulness is to become fruitless. So in verse 11, there'll be no birth, no pregnancy or conception. In verses 12 to 13, those who do manage to be born will die young. And the people will be characterized in verse 14 by miscarriages. And why is God punishing them so severely? Because of idolatry. Verse 15, all their wickedness is in Gilgal, for there I hated them, because of the wickedness of their doings. I will drive them out of my house. I will love them no more. All their princes are revolters. Ephraim is smitten. Their root is dried up, they shall bear no fruit. Yea, though they bring forth, yet will I slay the beloved fruit of their womb. My God will cast them away, because they did not hearken unto him, and they shall be wanderers among the nations. So again, in verses 15 to 17, because of idolatry, especially the apostasy of Gilgal, and again, Gilgal was one of the centers along with Bethel, which were idolatry centers. In verse 15, the sin of Gilgal is that which is characterized by wickedness and wicked deeds. Wickedness is their inward state, and for that he hates them. And their inward state leads to wicked outward deeds, and for that he will drive them out, and the rebellious princes will not feel the love of God any further. And we see Ephraim is smitten, their root is dried up, they shall bear no fruit. Fruitlessness, the whole root and plant will be totally dried up. That's the northern kingdom, Ephraim. My God will cast them away. They'll become wanderers among the nations. And that is where we will leave it tonight. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.